Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, depending on where in the world you are. I am in Rome, and it is a rainy, warm day in Rome. I know it's not so warm in other parts of the world, including our friends in Washington. So I'm Minh-Thu Pham, co-founder and CEO of the Starling Institute, which is a new think, do tank working on multilateral cooperation and trying to help ensure that it works for all. And we help to try to bring analysis and insights into the workings of multilateral cooperation, in particular around the UN. I'm grateful to be hosting this conversation because of the timing and the moment that we're in the relations between the US and the UN, and also for the UN itself at a moment of reform and reflection as we look at the outgoing Secretary General, a potential new Secretary General that will be taking over in 2027, and a slew of reforms that the current Secretary General Antonio Guterres has announced around UN 80 reforms, in part as a response to the financial crisis that the UN is facing right now, as a result of governments and their arrears to the UN, as well as just the deep need for a long time for the UN to reform. And we know that there have been other past reform efforts. We think there's a lot to learn from that, including understanding what the landmines are, what the potential political coalitions that are needed to be built to make reform happen, and just the understanding of the broader geopolitical environment. And we thought that given where we are right now, and that essentially, at least from our perspective at the Starling Institute, the financial crisis is really at the crux of the situation with the UN. And, when you don't have a couple of member states paying their dues on time, in full, and without conditions, it does throw the institution into a bit of a crisis. And we thought that it might be helpful to go back and look at times in the past when governments haven't paid their dues and the situation that transpired, and proposals for how we then get out of that situation. And so I'm really grateful to have here veterans of a past process in the late 1990s, from the Helms-Biden era. We've got a great group of speakers. And so we're going to reflect a bit on the past, try to take you all about 25 years into history. It doesn't feel like that long ago from where I sit, but 25 years does sound like a while. And then after we delve a little bit into that experience, and what we all remember from that, we'll also look into lessons learned. What can we apply from then to the situation now? Now, of course, the situation now is dramatically different. Lots of the actors have changed, the geopolitics have changed, a lot has changed. But there may be some insights from that, either things we shouldn't do or things we should do this time around as we're thinking about how we put the UN into a situation of greater financial stability. So with that, we've got a great group of speakers today, starting with Dr. Robert Orr, who is currently on sabbatical from the University of Maryland School of Policy. But at the time, and I'm going to be citing people's titles from back then, or positions back then, Bob was a deputy to the U.S. Permanent Representative to the UN, Ambassador Richard Holbrooke, when he was U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations from 1996 until 2001. We have Mark Lagon, who was a former senior staff to Senator Jesse Helms of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee at the time. We have Suzanne Nossel, who was former deputy to the U.S. Ambassador for Management and Reform at the U.S. Mission to the UN in New York at the time, and she was a lead negotiator of the UN agreement that underpinned the Helms-Biden Act getting through. And we also have Brett Schaefer, who at the time was Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation and is currently Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and has written a lot about Helms-Biden and about UN reform. And all five of us, I think, probably have scars from numerous other UN reform processes, including the one that we're about to talk about. And so hopefully we can bring that experience to bear. The way we're going to run this conversation, this is all, of course, on the record. It is being recorded, and this recording will also be posted on our website. So we'll start with going into the history. So what was Helms-Biden? What did it do? Why did it matter? And how did we get there? Including some of the diplomatic processes and machinations that got us there. And then we'll shift the conversation into what we can take from that that might apply to the present moment. So with that, let me first start out with Bob to share your insights from that time. I've asked everyone to delve back into the history. Of course, memories are, 25 years old, but hopefully this will be useful to everyone here. So Bob, let's let you kick it off. Go ahead.
Thank you, Minh-Thu. And it's great to see everyone, and really wonderful to see the Starling Institute filling this space. I think there is something valuable at times of institutional uncertainty and reform at the UN in revisiting the issue of the U.S. relationship with the UN, because institutionally at the UN, change has often depended on an active involvement of the United States. And absent that, I think there will be suboptimal outcomes. There's a very bad habit, both in Washington and at the UN, of saying that U.S. UN relations are at an all-time low. Unfortunately, this might actually be the case right now, but it was certainly the case also at that time in 1999 when the U.S. had run up almost $1 billion in arrears to the United Nations, and the U.S. was in danger of losing its vote in the General Assembly. That situation took a pretty sharp turn between 1999 and 2001, when the U.S. Congress passed the Helms-Biden Act, and the Clinton administration, led by Ambassador Holbrooke and his team, represented here by Suzanne Nossel, undertook what was to that point an unprecedented campaign of multilateral diplomacy with virtually every member state of the UN to secure a number of reforms that we'll talk about in just a minute at the UN in exchange for the payment of that almost $1 billion in back dues. The Helms-Biden Act was touted as a reform for arrears deal, and in some senses, it was. The heart of the exchange was reforming the UN scales of assessment, and as well as a number of management and reform benchmarks in exchange for the back dues. I want to just say a little bit about what was in that Reform for Arrears deal, as well as the second part of the campaign, the engagement with the U.S. Congress, at that time unprecedented. The $1 billion in arrears had come dominantly from UN peacekeeping bills that were being charged to the US over 30% based on the negotiated scale of assessment. The U.S., bound by a dole provision in the 1994 appropriations bill, was paying 25%, and that difference of 5% at a time of rapid growth of peacekeeping was, in fact, excuse me while I am printing just once. Okay. The That difference in over 5% in peacekeeping led to a significant arrearage. The general scale of assessment, the regular budget, and the specialized agencies were also in arrears, but that was a smaller percentage of the money. Enter the Helms-Biden Act. It did essentially three things. First, required the U.S. to lower its regular budget and specialized agency budget assessment to 22% from 25. Secondly, to lower the peacekeeping assessment from over 30% to 25%. Secondly, there were a group of what I would call good government management reforms, things that included a code of conduct, a personnel evaluation system, inspector general reports to be made public, payroll audits, A lot of nitty-gritty good government stuff. The U.S. also demanded to be put back on the UN's ACABQ, which was an important budget committee. And then thirdly, there were a series of certifications that the Clinton administration had to undertake, things from no UN sovereignty, no standing army, no borrowing authority, no taxation by the UN, no interest fees on arrears, no U.S. real property rights, and supremacy of the UN Constitution. While in New York terms, these were kind of obvious and throwaways, they were not as simple when it came to Washington. Um, Ambassador Holbrooke's team achieved virtually all the benchmarks, save a partial success on the peacekeeping assessment, which went down from over 30% to about 27%, later to creep down into 26 something, and then more recently creep back up. This achievement saved the U.S. taxpayer over $100 million in the first year, over $170 million in year two, and even greater amounts in subsequent years. Um, Real briefly, I wanted to talk about the other campaign, and that was the campaign not with the governments of the world at the UN, but with the U.S. Congress. Ambassador Holbrooke and I did over 100 individual meetings with members of Congress about the Reform for Arrears deal, but even more about the interests that the U.S. had at stake in the United Nations. We met with Republicans, Democrats, appropriators, authorizers, leadership, as well as rank and file in the Congress. This had never happened before in the history of U.S. relations with the UN. Many of these members of Congress were talking about the UN for the first time in their lives. And that part of the campaign was not so public. There was a public side to the campaign. There was an engagement not only of Senator Helms and Senator Biden, but the entire Senate Foreign Relations Committee met about not only this bill, but about the UN, the reforms, peacekeeping. And Senator Helms and a range of other members of Congress also went to the UN. In addition, after the deal was consummated, there was an extraordinary visit by a number of key ambassadors from the UN to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. This was very unusual, and I would say uncomfortable for a number of diplomats to be visiting the Congress of one of the member states. So there were a number of unprecedented things that happened as a part of this deal. And I wanted to just make sure that in addition to the reform for arrears piece, we also talk about the engagement with the U.S. Congress, which I think has again really not been focused on and really requires some attention.
Great. Thank you so much, Bob. And uh, I failed to mention that Bob is also a member of the board of the Starling Institute, and that we will also announce soon. So thanks so much, Bob. Mark, let's hear from your perspective, being in Senator Helms' office at the time. By the way, I'm a North Carolinian, and Senator Helms was my senator during this period. Go ahead.
A dominant and controversial figure for 30 years in the Senate. Um, I was a Senate Foreign Relations Committee staffer for the UN, 1999 to 2002, and really was focused on the implementation of Helms-Biden. Um, just as the bill had come together, I in fact traveled to Rome and to Geneva to do monitoring of the reforms as they apply to the World Health Organization, the International Labor Organization, and the Food and Agricultural Organization. In fact, my control officer in Geneva was one Linda Thomas Greenfield, who has had a remarkable career since. And I staffed Helms in his visit to the Security Council, the field hearing we had in New York, and the Security Council coming to DC, as Bob alludes to. The context: how did these arrears and peacekeeping come about? Well, the number of peacekeeping mandates spiked when Moscow began to agree to some of them instead of the Cold War situation of the U.S. and Moscow always disagreeing. There's great concern in Congress after peacekeeping missions in Somalia, the Srebrenica massacres, the Rwanda deployment not having an effect on preventing genocide. And at the time, the level of congressional concern was so high that there were monthly briefings required by um, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee by the administration about peacekeeping, and there was a court reporter maintaining a transcript. So just a sense of that tension. So thematically, let me sort of look at this. Funding is leverage, and it's more legitimate when we're talking about voluntary contributions to international organizations. But even when they are dues and a treaty obligation, funding is leverage. And this is one of the reasons why Senator Helms invited the ambassadors of Security Council members to Washington, and had them convene in the old Senate chamber and the lowest level of the Capitol to talk about that special role of the Congress and the Senate. The legislation has had 3 tranches of amounts of money to be released for the kinds of conditions that Bob laid out. But leveraging created scars for the future. And of course, one would think of the G77 of the Global South being most frustrated, but in fact, they were not the ones who had to really move. Those who were probably most angry were the UK and Japan, whose dues rates had to go up if the United States was going to go down. Multi-stakeholder and multilateral diplomacy is essential and works. This case shows that. And it took place, the multilateral diplomacy took place in capitals in New York and Washington. That Ambassador Holbrooke went to so many of the missions of countries that had never been visited, in their own offices, was essential. To do that kind of diplomacy, you need career people in the United States who have an incentive to spend a great deal of their career in the international organization area, which I don't think exists. And you need the strongest personnel, which is one reason why the Helms team agreed to an appeal from the State Department to remove a bar that had been put in place by Helms on any extra pay for people to work in New York, where it's deeply expensive, including to educate your kids. But the multi-stakeholder negotiations really did include so much of the Hill, as Bob describes. And they went the other way around. I mean, at the Helm staff, we heard from Holbrooke's team in New York, Holbrooke's office in Washington, the International Organization Bureau, and the Legislative Affairs Bureau, all of whom were asking what the others were doing. So lots of different players. I think a good cop, bad cop approach works. This is one of the reasons why Congress and the administration working on an issue together matters. Helms was the bad cop among the Republicans. Richard Holbrooke, who is not exactly a softy, in fact, prickly character, rest his soul, positioned himself as the good cop. This is why Holbrooke brought Helms for the first remarks by a legislator of any country before an informal session of the Security Council to display the bad cop. You have to deal with me, Holbrooke, because otherwise you're going to have this guy, Helms, to deal with. Compromise is essential. And that's the lesson of this. Senator Helms, Senator Biden, Kofi Annan, they all got things out of this arrangement that they would not have gotten had they not compromised. Biden would never want to question the treaty obligation of dues, but he went along with this formula in order to get those dues paid off. Um, you can a lesson I find is that it's fine to stake out an extreme position in a negotiation to elicit compromise from others if you take yes for an answer. Helms and Biden demonstrated they were willing to compromise when they were staking out more maximalist positions first. The fact that Ambassador Holbrooke came to Senator Helms, Chairman Helms, and said, I've gotten almost everything you want except for lowering the peacekeeping dues rate, didn't get down to 25%. Can you take yes for an answer? And Helms went along with a change in the legislation for that one element that hadn't been met in order for things to flow. And when Helms signaled that he was going to do it, it was very hard for other Republicans in the Senate and the House to object. I will note that the peacekeeping assessment rate has never gotten down to 25%. I'll hope a little later to talk about relevance to the current context.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. Suzanne, you were in New York at the time. Tell us about your experience then.
Sure. It was great to be here. Very nostalgic. So I was hired in from the outside. I was at McKinsey at the time. I had read Ambassador Holbrooke's book about ending the war in Bosnia, and I got intrigued, and I had just wrote him a letter when he was nominated, and sort of one thing led to another, and I had this opportunity to come and join him with the assignment of working to implement the Helms-Biden legislation, which had just been passed. And I knew nothing. I remember going to my first meeting and just sort of writing down that I needed to look up what is the Fifth Committee and what is the ACABQ, because I had never heard of either of them. When we got in at the UN, we were embarrassed by U.S. policy. We were in the longest period of sustained prosperity in our history as a country, the richest country in the world, and going around demanding that our dues be reduced, and that only if that was agreed to would we pay what we owed in back dues. I wrote an article later saying this is like Bill Gates not paying his taxes and then demanding a lower rate in order to make good on them. And when we first began to sort of present this idea to the UN membership, what we heard was, no, you pay on time, in full, and without conditions. That's how it works here at the UN. Our system is based on capacity to pay. You have the capacity to pay, and there's no excuse. I remember on one of my first few days, someone said, yeah, we had to go down from 25 to 22% for the regular budget scale of assessment rate. And it was suggested to me by a colleague that it was very simple. We just should get China to pay the additional 3% because they were a rising power. And I thought, I sort of remember writing that down thinking, well, that's a good idea. That would solve it. But what I quickly realized was there was no way that was going to happen. The UN had an assessment scale that was based on a formula involving GDP and per capita income, and that the only way to achieve what we wanted would be to adjust that formula. There was not going to be any kind of side deal, that was considered totally unacceptable within the UN system. And so we had to make a pivot, and we did a lot of research into the UN's assessment system, and we found kind of a crucial fact about the peacekeeping scale that I would say opened the door to our success in the negotiation, which was that the peacekeeping formula included discounts for low-income countries, and those discounts had been set in the early 1970s, and they had never been adjusted. So when we got there in the late 1990s, you had Gulf countries, Singapore, South Korea, all paying a fifth of what the scale would have dictated for the peacekeeping expenses because they were considered low-income countries, and the system was very out of date. And that actually became the basis for an argument that what we needed was scale reform and to put the UN's financial system on a stronger, more up-to-date footing. And it kind of neutralized what was really a power play and a diktat coming from Washington. And we were able to sort of describe it as a reform effort that was meant to correct a out of date scale that was not based on current data and financial circumstances of participating countries. And, it was a fig leaf. It was cover for what we were doing, but it made all the difference because it allowed other countries to kind of keep their heads held up high as they gradually came to around to the fact that with the U.S. exerting this leverage, there was little alternative for the UN, but in some form to cut a deal. And so we built a team. We actually got the State Department somehow to approve 4 new positions for staff to work on this. We hired Anderson Consulting to create for us our own calculator for the scale of assessment so that we could do calculations ourselves and see if you adjusted the formula, how that would work out for different countries. We created these laminated cards that told every country, had the assessment rates of every country for the regular budget and peacekeeping and sort of what they would have to pay if the scale was adjusted in the way that we were proposing. And then as Bob and others touched on, we went mission to mission in New York. I remember trailing behind the ambassador, clutching these laminated cards, doing shoe leather diplomacy across the streets of the East Side and Turtle Bay. We went all over the world. We went to capitals. I remember going to an AU meeting in Lomé, Togo, where Gaddafi had his whole delegation hosting us in a reception in a tent. We did horse trading. We did a cable to all missions around the world, and we said, "Look, we need to get your governments, host governments, to accept this deal. What is a point of leverage in the bilateral relationship that might bring them around?" Because they all were pretty resistant. I remember the Uruguay, our mission in Uruguay said, well, it's definitely going to have to do with beef. The Uruguayans want to be able to export more beef into the United States. And, we got them a meeting with the agricultural department to talk about their aspirations for beef. And, we just took a very expansive and kind of creative approach about how to weave this into U.S. diplomacy and find sources of leverage. And at the same time, Holbrooke was relentlessly cultivating this whole diplomatic core. He had celebrities at his apartment at the Waldorf, and he would invite the ambassadors to fancy dinners, to hobnob with sports figures and entertainers, and just create this sort of aura of, where he was very invested in the UN and what happened there. The SFRC visit, which others have touched on, was was very dramatic. Jesse Helms in the well of the Security Council. I was Joe Biden's control officer that day. We had the SFRC hearing at the New York Bar Association to a packed room. We then brought the ambassadors, as has been touched on, down to Washington. What I remember, which is such a relic of the pre-9/11 days, was that President Clinton was out of town, and Holbrooke somehow got permission to bring the ambassadors of the Security Council into the Oval Office. And we were like picking up trinkets in the Oval Office to look at them all together. So it was just a very unique experience that he created for his diplomatic counterparts. But even with all of that, it still took Ted Turner coming in at the last minute to help bridge a funding shortfall and sort of soften the blow of the dues increases that countries were going to have to bear so that they could bear them more gradually. And that was the genesis of the UN Foundation. That's how Ted Turner sort of, I think, first got involved in UN issues and made that investment. And that was catalytic and really put us, in a position. And I think Holbrooke's intuition to know that In the end, Helms would exercise flexibility that we didn't have to achieve 100% to the letter of what was spelled out in the legislation, which always puzzled me. I thought surely we can't, call this a success unless we deliver all of that. But he understood that in the end, if we made a sort of strong enough showing that there would be some discretion and flexibility. And I think it was not just because of all the effort into the dues deal, but also what he accomplished alongside that. I remember presenting that at the SFRC at the end of his term and talking about African peacekeeping and the UN Security Council's first resolution ever on a health issue, which was HIV/AIDS, and just a set of accomplishments, getting Israel admitted into one of the UN's regional groups, which was one of his major objectives. And that combination of what was recognized as a kind of Herculean effort to get this very unpopular dues deal through, but also making the most of the US's leadership opportunity at the United Nations, got him into a position where it was, being on I remember we called a glide path to 25, which, as Mark points out, the US has never gotten to a rate as low as 25% on the peacekeeping. But getting to that, what we called the glide path, was considered sufficient. So I think I'll stop there, and then we can go hopefully in the discussion to some of the lessons that I think may apply to today. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much, Suzanne. And Suzanne is also a senior advisor with Starling Institute. Brett, you've written a lot about this, and I think you've, maybe like me, have been on this journey for a long time looking at UN reform. What do you remember from those days, and what's your perspective?
Sure. I mean, a lot of things have already been discussed in terms of the context up in New York, the negotiations in New York, the interactions between Congress and the U.S. government, and then the rather unprecedented interactions with other governments in the U.S. Congress, particularly the Senate, in those negotiations and getting to a compromise. A couple of things that I'll just add to this. One is Mark is absolutely right that the sharp increase in peacekeeping expenses related to the increase in both size, scope, and number of peacekeeping operations from the late 1980s through the mid 1990s precipitated this crisis and precipitated the U.S. cap on U.S. contributions to peacekeeping. The cost of those operations increased roughly tenfold from just under $400 million in the late 1980s to over $4 billion by the mid 1990s. And so what had been something maybe that the U.S. had objected to in principle prior to that about the U.S. level of contributions became a money issue later on, which led to the U.S. reaction and the actions by Congress. One other thing that I'd relate to that is this is a long-standing complaint that the United States has with the United Nations, dating all the way back to the negotiations over the UN Charter. The U.S. wanted to have an explicit level of maximum contributions in the UN Charter. That was not realized in the negotiations. But at the very beginning, in 1945, when those discussions for the expenses of the organization were being conducted, the U.S. was originally going to be assigned an assessment of almost 50%, 49 point something. And it was absolutely explosive reaction on the part of the U.S. To refuse that. And we got a lower assessment. And over time, through the late 1940s through the 1950s, the U.S. incrementally reduced that assessment for the regular budget. And the peacekeeping operations weren't really a factor early on because there weren't very many of them. And the ones that were adopted were rather limited in scope. Things like Kashmir or the UN Truce Supervisory Organization or operation in the Middle East, which were regular budget operations, the only ones. And then later on, peacekeeping operations were adopted with sort of expenses to the member states on a separate scale, sort of boutique assessments as they were developed. But the U.S. kept at that complaint, said we need to have lower assessments in this organization. And they did so for two reasons. One, they didn't want member states paying de minimis amounts. They wanted everybody to have some sort of investment in the organization. And second, they didn't think that it was right for the organization to be overly reliant on a single member state or a handful of member states for the expenses of the organization because it would give them undue influence over the operations and of the United Nations, which they thought as a universal membership body was an inappropriate relationship. And so that continues today, but it's been a historical fact in the U.S. relationship with the UN since the very beginning. One thing looking back that strikes me as different from today was how deeply involved Congress was in this effort. If you look around right now, in the current circumstance, this is not being driven by Congress. This is being driven by the administration. And I think that's unfortunate because what Helms-Biden did is it set the framework for the negotiation. It said this is what the United States wants. This is what the United States objectives are in return for payments. And therefore, it set the rules essentially for the debate inside the UN and with the other member states. And that's lacking right now. That lack of clarity, I think, is undermines the effort of the United States to actually get reforms enacted in the UN because they're not quite certain what the US wants. Now, that has been clarified slowly over the past few months, where the United States has embraced the Secretary General's reform agenda, UN 80, but asked for additional things. But what are the extent of those additional asks? How far does the U.S. want to go? In particular, Work Stream 3, where they're talking about consolidation of UN activities, funds, programs. What is the U.S. objective there? What programs does it want to see merged? What is sufficient to release payments? Is the United States actually going to make payments if these reforms are adopted? All of that is actually very ambiguous right now. And I think it undermines the effort of the United States to actually get other member states to commit to this process. So, looking back over Secretary Helms' speech to the UN Security Council, I was struck by a few things. One is how much for granted he took um, the position of Congress in this role. He said, "We are a co-equal branch of government. The United States executive branch does not have the authority to do this without our permission. Therefore, you need to respect not just what the ambassador is saying to you, but also what my constituents are saying to me, which is going to lead me to either approve or not approve of the payment of arrears." And that dynamic, I think, is missing right now. And I think that that's unfortunate. Um, Not that the administration, I think, can't get Congress to pay it at the end of the day, but if you're going to have a permanent resolution to this problem or to this issue, you do need to have bipartisan buy-in by Congress to actually fulfill a commitment to pay at the end of the day if you do get the reforms that the administration wants. And the administration needs to consult with Congress to make sure that whatever reforms they are pursuing are sufficient to meet the expectations of Congress as well. Because this is a relationship of two co-equal branches of government, regardless of whether one is rather silent at the moment. And that reality is going to result in whether this is going to be a successful effort or not. So I'll just go ahead and halt there, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about the current circumstances.
Great. Thanks so much. Thanks, Brett. Thanks to all of you. That was a great trip down memory lane and also starting to tease in some of the implications for today. So, part of the reason why we decided to host this meeting is because when you look at the financial stability of the organization, it seems incredibly unhealthy for an institution with 193 members that has such an impact around the world, including in peace operations, but across the board, to be then dependent on the domestic politics of essentially two governments who are the main funders. And then especially obviously the founding government, the United States. And so, we thought, is there a moment right now for us to yet again revisit, and thanks for the history, Brett, to revisit the scales so that it is a little bit more balanced and that you're not having to every time, figure out, is the administration or the Congress or is the U.S. going to pay up? Or are the Chinese going to pay on time? So, I wonder for the four of you, is this a moment to revisit? And maybe just putting it into the broader context. So the Secretary General has announced a set of reforms. There are three work streams. The first is on the UN's budget. So the regular budget, the Secretary General has, even before understanding what it would take to bring the US back and to get the US to pay the dues, the Secretary General has proposed across the board cuts of about 15% of the budget, the regular budget, and about 18, 19% of the staff. The second work stream is on a mandate review. And for my sins, I ran the first one when I was working for Bob in Kofi Annan's office. And this time around, they're looking at a mandate implementation review. How can member states adopt better mandates so that then they are executed in the right way? And then lastly is work stream 3, what Brett, you just mentioned, is looking at structural reforms. So are there mergers or consolidation across the UN system outside of the Secretariat that can be done? Are there ways to sort of streamline the work of the UN? And I think for many right now, we're in the midst of budget discussions. This is all going to culminate usually at the end of December to reduce the regular budget. And yet again, you look at sort of the narrow view of, will we even have a budget at the end of December to fund the UN next year? And more importantly, is it even tenable for us to just keep having this crisis year after year as to whether the US will pay or the Chinese will pay? So is this a moment, question all of you, for us to potentially look at the assessment rates again? And then what are the pitfalls? What are the considerations? Bob, let's go to you first. Go ahead.
I'll jump in right there, Minh-Thu, because I think Suzanne's epiphany early on in her tenure that there was no silver bullet out of this. We can't, arm twist the Chinese and just call it a day. The scales of assessment and the allocation of the expenses of the UN is the place to start this discussion. And not just on peacekeeping, but on regular budget and specialized agency budgets as well. For the UN to function efficiently, you really do have to get rid of free riders. And I know that's a bit rich for many countries hearing that from an American, because in some ways the US has become a free rider on various UN services. But for the UN to work properly, that scales of assessment does need to be reviewed, and some of the rigidities of it have to be taken out permanently. And by that, I mean the formula that Suzanne and her colleagues helped negotiate made some progress on things like the lag period between a country's GDP growth and what its scale would be. I think it was 6 years, and I think you guys got it down to 4.5 years, Suzanne. The lag period is too long. Countries that are wealthier need to start paying sooner. So I think things like that need to be built into the UN scale of assessment for its own good. There's also, I think, the peacekeeping issue and the prerogatives of the P5 issue. The Security Council is dysfunctional today. And it's dysfunctional not because of a single country's irresponsibility. All five of the P5 have a veto. They all bear certain responsibilities for making the peace and security side of the House work. And for that, they pay a nominal extra amount of dues for peacekeeping. I think that piece of the equation could be looked at, and probably should be looked at. Just two other quick observations. I think this synchronization of reform and leverage is really important that both Mark and Brett talked about. Mark said good cop, bad cop works. And Brett said it's not driven by Congress right now, which is absolutely true. I think we need Congress back in the game. And the irony here might be that ultimately Congress needs to re-enter the game as a quasi good cop, which is we will actually pay for reform if you can get them.
Mhm.
And I think Brett kind of pointed in that direction. And I think for that to happen, there needs to be an interlocutor with the Congress. And let's just say the likelihood of the Trump administration being the bridge between Congress and the member states of the UN is not terribly likely right now. So I do look towards the possibility of a new Secretary General coming in the new year and having to engage with the United States, not only administration, but with Congress as a bridge builder between the world's governments and the co-equal branch of Congress in the United States. It will make nobody comfortable. No one will like doing that. Certainly not a new Secretary General, various governments around the world, certainly the Trump administration, and certainly those in Congress. But if we don't find a lineup that is willing to talk about the reform and U.S. payment of money, I think we're going to be looking at really the crumbling of this key part of international architecture that has helped maintain the peace and build the prosperity of the world over the last 75, 80 years.
Thanks, Bob. Anyone else want to hop in and comment on implications and lessons?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been opposed to reopening the scale just because of how difficult that negotiation was and what a time suck it was. I would only recommend it if if there was a diplomatic kind of side deal that could be cooked up in capitals and kind of put into the UN. If you could get a large group of middle, and upper income countries to agree to pay substantially more, and also devise a formula for it, because I think that notion that it can't be an ad hoc system, that there has to be sort of some measure of objectivity and fairness. I don't see the UN membership backing away from that. And so, to start again in the UNGA without kind of an outcome quite well baked, I think is just a recipe for deadlock. I don't think the US would get the deal through that we got 25 years
Right.
ago now, for any number of reasons, and in significant part because the goodwill is not there. The goodwill that we built up, I think, would be very difficult to summon now. And I don't, the piece about the Congress not committing itself to paying up in return for reform, I think is going to be hard to surmount.
Go ahead, Mark.
Well, just in terms of implications for today, by the way, nations always present their own interests as principles. The United States saying that no country should, pay too disproportionate a size of the peacekeeping or the regular dues. A cap meant less for the United States, and lots of nations do that and have. Um, could this work today? Well, I'm tempted to say yes, in that, funding being held back gets others' attention. You only need to see Secretary General Guterres or WHO Director General Tedros's responses to money not flowing, by putting reforms on the table. I'm tempted to say yes, in that people know that Donald Trump likes deals, and likes deals more than consistency. But I think on balance, I think this can't be done again, because you can't use the same playbook repeatedly. The scars are too
Bonjour.
substantial. And you know,
Hey,
the Chairman
do you have any
Hyde and
croissants
Chairman
left?
Ross
Croissant?
Leighton tried to
No.
have similar legislation to Helms and Biden, but that they never had the same impact. Show you a little bit about the playbook not being able to be repeated. The United States for a long time hasn't taken yes for an answer. In the Helms-Biden situation, it did, but it's gotten the changes to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea it asked for years ago and has never ratified it. For a long time under the Bush 41 and President Clinton, the United States did not get back into UNESCO, even though most of its asks had been met. Um, I also suspect that it's countries watch the U.S. go in and out of organizations or threaten to leave organizations and then come back in. UNESCO, World Health Organization, Human Rights Council. There might be a sense the United States is fickle. But the two key reasons why a similar formula can't be pursued today is a bipartisan consensus is not possible in the Congress today with the polarization. And I'll just mention and note that there was a unity of Republicans and Democrats of skepticism about the UN with regard to its treatment of Israel, whereas now there's division among Democrats about, you know, um, support for Israel in the wake of Gaza. Tom Lantos was a key figure in the House. He always had a motivation to be for UN reform because of that concern on Israel. But Brett is right. The biggest question here today is Congress not being involved. And it was less involved in the 2005 reforms when I was a Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Organizations. And Republicans in Congress, frankly, in Congress in general, have abdicated their role on the UN, indeed, in many ways, on foreign policy. And that's a problem, actually, for getting things done. For fans of unity of the executive, Congress actually helps elicit change in international organizations.
Thanks so much.
Um,
Yeah, Brett, so, I
there's
want to
so
go to
much
you,
to
but yeah, there's a lot here. Can I also just ask, is there an
yeah.
opportunity though that it is pretty much in the hands of the White House and the
Yeah.
administration right now that you don't, that obviously you need, there should be a greater balance of power, that you should have
Mhm.
a role for Congress here. But is this more like a NATO situation where the administration just says, we're not going to pay anymore, we need everybody else to step up, and so just figure out how to do it? And is there kind of a more efficient deal to be had here, along with other comments that you have?
Um, I think there are multiple moving parts there. First of all, the administration has withheld funding to the UN. It's done so with very strong resolve. It started at the beginning. It hasn't shifted away from that. It has made very clear that it's not willing to pay unless it gets reforms to the UN. That includes dues that are owed from the regular budget from 2024. It includes all of the regular budget funding for 2025. It involves some of the peacekeeping dues for the current year in operations. And it is made very clear that is not going to make payments unless there are changes that are made that are acceptable to the administration. Mark is right that Congress has a role here. Um, I disagree that there is not an opportunity for bipartisan compromise here, because I do think that the Democrats in Congress would support payment if there are reforms that were successful. And I think the Republicans would go along with those payments if the administration signaled that they were satisfied with the reforms that they achieved. So there is a window here, an opportunity. And it really depends on the other member states to negotiate with the administration and end up with a result that satisfies them. I think that it's important to provide carrots and sticks in this process. The administration has done plenty of sticks. It is withholding. It is willing to leverage those dues for reforms. It has signaled that it's willing to end peacekeeping operations if we don't get reforms. But there has to be a carrot side of this as well, whether that is signaling partial payment, say 2024 dues, in return for adoption of the UN 80 agenda, but holding payment for 2025 for implementation because there's a lot of implementation that needs to happen in the spring, the summer, and next fall. But there has to be a signal that the United States is actually willing to pay if the other member states follow through and do adopt the reforms that the U.S. wants. And that was one of the key measures of success for the Helms-Biden arrangement was that the U.S. did follow through and make payments. And that has to be a dynamic that is on the table here. And the administration, if it's going to be successful, I think has to make that clear. In terms of the scales, there are so many different moving parts here. One of the things that I think is possibility for reigniting the scales debate is that China is now above 20%. And we are in a situation where you have two member states that are feeling the bite of higher dues. China can bring along, I think, a lot of the G77 and other countries to this debate. Whether it's going to be successful or not is hard to say, but when you have two large voices in the room arguing for the same outcome, I think it's the possibilities are increased. And I think it's important to point out that a number of member states pay very, very little in terms of both the peacekeeping and the regular budget. They pay about $43,000 a year if you're at the lowest level of assessment for both the peacekeeping and the regular budget. A majority of the UN member states pay less than $1 million a year. And so when you have a majority of the UN membership paying so little, and then a handful of countries at the top paying so much, I mean, the United States pays the combined assessments of 184 member states. This is not a sustainable relationship, a sustainable financial foundation for the organization to pursue here. And one remark that Bob made, which is that the next Secretary General needs to weigh in. I don't think the organization has the time for that. They're in a financial spiral right now that is going to start affecting the operations of the organization in a very significant way. I think it's incumbent on the member states to take this very seriously and not wait until the next Secretary General has an opportunity to weigh in to move forward on this. And they need to engage with this administration, find out exactly what would satisfy them in order to secure some of these payments to relieve the financial crisis that is in place right now. Because I guarantee you, this administration is not going to make payments simply to alleviate the financial crisis without getting some kind of reforms at the end. So I'll just end it there. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Let me open the floor for questions. And in the meantime, Bob, do you want to reply or anyone else want to hop in and jump in with a comment?
Yeah, I wanted to come in real quickly. I agree with Brett that we can't wait for the next Secretary General to address the immediate crisis. I was really talking about the longer term effort to address the structural anomalies that are consistently leading to arrears by the U.S. Administration after administration, Congress after Congress. But I agree with Brett that the immediate crisis has to be addressed now. I think that going into this conversation, like Suzanne, I'm very leery about trying to push for fundamental changes like scale reform, knowing how hard it is. But there are problems with the scale in its rigidity. And if we don't acknowledge that, even if we get a solve for the immediate problems, we're just going to run into this again. So I think the long-term effort has to get into things like the base period for the scales, has to address the P5 prerogatives issue and their percentage of the budget. And because I think, as Brett and Mark mentioned, that China being in a different place now makes this a different conversation. So I would address the long-term structural issues, but not wait for the current arrears for reform deal that really is needed with the Trump administration right now.
Thanks so much. And just on China, I mean, I wonder if this administration would, in wanting to maybe reduce its dues, be okay with, for instance, the Chinese paying more and therefore maybe being seen as having more influence in the UN, how that would go over, not just with the administration, but the rest of Washington. I see that Andrew Hyde has his hand up. And if anyone else has a question, go ahead and raise your hand. Either signal to me on the, and turn on your video, by the way, if you do, or just you can also put your question into the chat and I can read it out loud. Go ahead, Andrew.
Great. Oh, thank you, Minh-Thu, for putting this together, and thanks to Starling. Great to have you on the scene here, and good to see some familiar faces. Brett, Mark, Suzanne. We've talked before, and Bob. I was at State in the first part of the first Trump administration, and led sort of what turned out to be an aborted effort on the scales then. And so a lot of what you're talking about, both historically and the current problems, resonate very well with me because I ran into some of those too. And like Suzanne was saying, did some traveling around the world to talk to key stakeholders, and found a fair amount of resistance, not to great surprise on that issue. But I think it was very important for us to do it at the time and to explore that. I guess as I listened to this conversation, though, I wanted to just sort of tease out a little bit of the differences. We seem to be sliding back and forth between scales and UN reform, UN budget. And I think there's obviously they're interrelated, but they are separate and distinct as well. So the scales obviously is the U.S. share. But I think what I've heard more from this administration, the second Trump administration, is really concerned about spending effectiveness at the UN. I haven't heard as much, and maybe I'm just not paying attention to the right sources, about the share the U.S. has. It's not that it isn't high, and Brett's points are very well taken, I think, in terms of the overall sort of U.S. concerns. But I think UN 80 and the reforms that we're seeing proposed and discussed are really more about the overall budget and how effectively it's being spent. So I think it's important to pull those apart a little bit and see where there is opportunity, I think, to move ahead. I agree with Brett definitely about the congressional role. I think what's lacking, of course, is a clarity of goals that the U.S. and the Congress and the White House would share for the UN. I sort of detect almost a nihilism on the Hill about the UN in many ways. Like, well, what's the point of it? Why do we really care? Why does the UN matter to U.S. interests? And so, in one sense, we have to take a step back and have that conversation again, I think, and update it for the current era to say, yes, in fact, the UN is really vital to U.S. national interest. Here's why. Here's what we need to do to lead on that. I think if we get that foundation in place, then the Congress and the White House can do more. So I just would be interested in having the panelists sort of address the larger question, I guess, of the UN's relevance to U.S. national interest in the current environment. Thank you.
Great.
Can
Thanks so much.
I talk about Andrew's first question
Please.
rather than the second
Yeah.
question? The first question on the scales, I mean, the new scale was just passed. And so I think from the perspective of trying to adjust it, it's more of a marathon than it is a sprint at this point. And so the discussions, I think, have to start, but they don't necessarily have to culminate this year, which is why I think the administration is focused more on the reform agenda, which is more tied to the payment of arrears or the payment of current dues in that context right now. So I think that's why you don't see a whole lot of talk about it. It's the urgency of what's on the table right now rather than what may be possible in 2.5 years.
Brett, can
Yeah,
I
I mean,
also
just from my part, I want to sound a note of skepticism that the Chinese position, makes them some kind of natural ally of the U.S. On an adjustment to the scale. I don't see it. I mean, China's always been so aligned with the G77 and the developing world. I don't see them getting behind any formula that would require even the lowest paying countries who are, got $45,000 a year dues to pay more. I just think that goes against their political positioning, and they would not want to be seen as kind of part of a U.S. agenda on that issue. And the UN is a place where some of these kind of old ideologies die very hard. And so it reminds me of being told, just get China to go up to 3%. I'm not sure it's much more likely now than it was back then. I completely agree on the question of, the Washington debate about the UN. And, it's so striking to me that it always kind of zeroes in on these very kind of picayune if legitimate issues. I think they're now focused on compensation, paying for tuition for UN employees and what the salary rates are in different jurisdictions. And, I think they have some points probably to make about that, but kind of trying to shift the discussion to sort of what the US gets out of the UN. And even though we've had on Haiti and the Gaza resolution for the Trump administration, some significant moments just in the last couple of months at the UN, it seems like there's, what I hear is that, the UN Foundation takes delegations to see UN operations around the world, and people are amazed and impressed, but they just say they can't kind of poke their head above the parapet to say that in Washington. And so I have a concern that it's just sort of ideologically dictated rather than a kind of practical analysis of how the UN is benefiting the United States and what might be the most constructive posture from the standpoint of U.S. interests. And I'm curious, for Brett or anyone else, in terms of whether you see it that way and how that might shift.
Thanks so much. We've got 2 questions and we have 7 minutes left. Let me also, and I think a few questions in the chat as well. But just to Brett's point about the administration not having set a framework for paying its dues back. Is this intentional? Why do we think they have it? Is it that then you can sort of move the goalposts and have a sort of never-ending cycle of the UN trying to appease in the hopes that the dues will be paid? Or is it just that they haven't gotten around to it and figured it out? So if you want to hold on that, let's go to Roland Rich. Go ahead. And please keep it short.
Yeah, thanks for giving me the floor, and hi to old mates around the room. Look, I'm not going to be diplomatic. I'm going to get straight to the point. This is a pretty solipsistic discussion from Washington's point of view, and frankly, it's pretty irrelevant. We're not going to see any sort of repeat of Helms-Biden these days. The Trump administration wants a certain outcome, and it's achieving it. That is, for the UN to become irrelevant. And we're heading exactly in that direction. The UN will become irrelevant if we continue down this path. And if we believe that's an acceptable outcome, fine. But if we want a United Nations that can actually deliver what the charter drafters thought should happen, we need a complete change in the way things happen, and we need to minimize the influence of member states. I know all about sovereignty, but we need to minimize the influence of member states. How? By having a true Tobin tax to allow the UN to fund itself without these machinations of the member states. And in my book, I've put it in the chat.
Thank you so much.
I explain a Tobin tax based on a tax on globalization. Thanks.
Thanks so much.
Minh-Thu.
Hey, John, go ahead.
Sorry, took a second. So the U.S. has been saying, the UN needs to get to basics, and at the beginning it was very much emphasizing in that regard peace and security as the basics. Later on, I have heard statements that they recognize that actually the UN has 3 pillars, including development and human rights. Can you talk a little bit about this? Division of across the pillars of the UN, and of course the G77 very much emphasizing the development pillar and not wanting to have any cuts on that side of the house, versus the peace and security pillar, which is actually the most problematic pillar at the moment. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Hank-Jan. All right, well, let's go around, and also if you want to make your final comments. Let me start with Brett, since I think some of these comments were directed to you, and then we'll go to the others. Go ahead. Final comments.
Sure. In terms of the Tobin tax, I just don't think that that's a practical proposal. The United States, most other governments are not going to endorse, maybe not most, but many other member states are not going to endorse the idea for the UN to have an independent funding stream through taxation. it first of all, it undermines their power and their leverage, which they don't care for. Second, it reduces accountability that they have over the UN system, in something that I think the United States in particular would be opposed to. In terms of the three different pillars, I think that this is a recognition by the United States of the interests and what the other member states value in the organization. Now, I think when you get down to details, you may see different ideas. For instance, what does the United States see as valuable human rights in terms of the actions of the organization? From what they've said, it's more things like freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom of association, things that the United States has long valued and are included in our own Bill of Rights. But if you get down to things like the right to development, right to food, right to health, I think the administration would probably have very different ideas in terms of what the organization should do or what it would endorse in terms of the organization's priorities. On development, I think you see the same thing. The administration has said that they want to pursue development with developing countries. They want to do it in a cooperative way, but they want to focus on trade, investment, and other aspects of pursuing development, not necessarily through the traditional development framework of foreign assistance. And they've rejected that, for instance, through the repudiation of the SDGs. So, yes, the administration is going to work with other countries where they can on these issues to recognize that they value these, but I wouldn't see that as an endorsement of the UN system or the UN approach historically on those aspects. I'm sorry, Minh-Thu, did I miss something else?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, why do you think the administration hasn't yet laid out what it would take for them to pay the dues?
I think they probably have to negotiate that with the White House, and that's a conversation that's probably ongoing. Once they start getting some idea about what can be achieved and what the other member states might support in terms of perhaps adopting the UN 80, maybe that's the conversation they end up going to the White House and saying, okay, what can we do to try and sweeten this pot to continue these reforms process going forward?
Great, thanks. So we're going to go to Suzanne, Mark, and then Bob. Final comments.
Yeah, I think Brett is right that this administration sort of looks at the development agenda, through a very different lens. And there's always been a kind of dubiousness on the American side about some of the UN's development activities and, essentially the political horse trading that you have to do in a member-led body to reflect the breadth of priorities. And the U.S., particularly, I think the Trump administration is particularly kind of allergic to being sort of sitting as one among many in the General Assembly, where they kind of have one seat and they have to negotiate with everyone. They don't see that, they're willing, if there's a deal that can be done, even in the Security Council, I think there's some openness to that. But I think there's a kind of reflexive rejection of the notion of kind of playing ball and that there's a give and take and that you get some of what you want in return for supporting some of others' priorities. And I think that worldview, even though it might be held most fiercely by a kind of small inner core of advisors and policy influentials, really holds sway in this administration. So I think on that basis, it would take a lot to get them to compromise in the way that would be necessary to get a deal done on reform for a restoration of U.S. dues. And, I think for those who think that's important, and, all of us have devoted a portion of our career to the UN, I think it's a worthwhile task, because I agree with the person who said this is existential for the UN, and we may, we risk having a substantially weakened system for a long time to come if we don't find some resolution. So I agree with the effort. I don't think it's going to be easy, kind of given the worldview that this administration brings and their reflexive rejection of the type of multilateral body that is the UNGA.
Thanks so much, Suzanne. Mark.
Trying to offer some different complementary perspectives. Three thoughts. One, I agree with Bob Orr that the UN has contributed to and continues to contribute to international security. I'm not so sure I agree with Bob about how much it's contributed to prosperity and development. Second point is this lingering question: is the Trump administration's approach to the UN just a more extreme version of what you've always seen in U.S. unilateralism? I think it's of a different character. And third point is related to that. Suzanne, Roland Rich, and I have devoted substantial portions of our career to democracy and human rights. It used to be a concern of the United States that sort of equal legitimacy was given to democratic states and to autocratic states. That's one of the reasons why people seem to have objected to flagrant, autocratic human rights abusers being on the Human Rights Council. But the Trump administration view is purely one of sovereignty. And in in reality, the UN is a creature of national sovereignty and it protects it too much, not too little. And regime type and democracy are not priorities of the Trump administration.
Thanks so much, Mark. Bob, final words?
I would say genuine good government management reform is always needed by pretty much all organizations, and the UN included. I would pursue the reforms that make sense in the UN, but make sure that they are pursued in such a way that on the backside, the Trump administration and the US Congress could actually give something for those reforms. Doing the reforms just for running a better ship is not would not meet the moment right now. On the budget, budget tightening is in order at this moment, but again, that the UN should get something for being responsible in terms of the US meeting its obligations. I think the third issue that is distinct from budget and absolute amounts is the allocation of responsibilities of funding the organization. And if we don't get that right, we are fated to continue having this discussion, not every 20 years, but every 2 years. And so the allocation of the scales, especially on peace and security issues, and the peacekeeping budget still drives the financial concerns of the key member states. It is also the most dysfunctional part of the United Nations right now. Hence, an opportunity to try to put responsibility where the privileges are in the P5 and try to address the peacekeeping discussion, the budget discussion, and see if we can't at the same time make a more functional P5 in the Security Council by making them step up to earn those privileges they have.
All right, thank you so much. Brett, were you gonna make a last comment?
I just want to say that we do have a precedent where the administration has threatened to withdraw, withheld in return for getting some reforms. And then when those reforms are adopted, it withdrew that threat and then made payments and engaged as it always has in the past with the UPU back in the first Trump administration. So there is a signal that the administration will follow through in terms of making good on its promises if reforms are indeed adopted. I would not dismiss the possibility just because those parameters haven't been laid out that they are not present or possible.
Thanks so much, Brett, for that. Yeah, I think there's some skepticism, including in the chat, as to whether the administration has any intention ever, regardless of how much reform takes place at the UN, ever to pay its dues. And I think really the goal here is to see how do we eventually get back on that path where not only would the U.S. pay its dues and its treaty obligations, but other countries would do so in full, on time, and without conditions. And I think there is something to say for considering systemic changes or some of the changes that we're talking about to get the organization on a healthier footing. So with that, I just really thank everyone for engaging and staying on a little bit longer. I thought this was a fantastic conversation. Please do send other suggestions to us. If you have additional questions for the panelists, send them to me and we can pass them along to the panelists. Thanks so much for joining, everyone. Thanks to our speakers.